Hello again, everyone. It's really good to be back with you. I'm Chad Harris, and I apologize for such a long delay, but I am really excited to share with you the research I've been doing. So, what we're going to do is look at two narratives. We're going to look at the chronology of Donald Trump's life, primarily through the lens of his relationship to the archetype associated with Saturn, as well as through psychological complexes of splitting, denial, and othering. We're also going to look at the evolution of consciousness and humanity's relationship to the world and to the cosmos from the hunter-gatherer primal worldview through the archaic and axial era religious and philosophical revolutions to the modern scientific revolution to our current postmodern existential crisis. I'm offering these ideas up in the spirit of collaboration and dialogue. They push the limits of my understanding in many ways, and I look forward to exploring them further with you through the questions and comments and in future presentations. We're going to be exploring really complex ideas, but important ideas that challenge our understanding of the nature of reality. Now, we should begin by contextualizing that with our current worldview, which is rendered to us by modern science and is described as Big Bang cosmology. So, the basic idea is the universe exploded 13.7 billion years ago, is expanding, and is governed by general relativity and the laws of quantum mechanics. The narrative also assumes that the universe is devoid of intelligence, meaning, or purpose, and somehow accidentally or randomly created a highly intelligent, meaning seeking species out of what we are told is a purposeless, unconscious universe. It doesn't make any sense. It's absurd in many ways. And I believe the astrological perspective counters it and can help us understand our embedded participatory relationship or participatory nature of our relationship to the cosmos. Now, what's helpful in this is that quantum mechanics, properly understood in my opinion, and I'm working off of Niels Bohr's ideas and original theories, as well as Wolfgang Pauli, and Karen Barad has extended Bohr's understanding into what she calls a ethico-onto-epistemological combination, basically that the way that we understand the nature of reality actually co-creates the ontology of it and has ethical dimensions built in. So this is a very different understanding to the nature of reality than a purposeless cosmos that is randomly, accidentally created us with no intention or purpose. Then we'll compare and contrast the two narratives to see what insights we can gain to help us better understand the nature of reality and how we can better navigate the future moving forward. So let's dive right in. I'll be drawing largely from the work of Richard Tarnas in Passion of the Western Mind, Understanding the Ideas That Have Shaped Our Worldview, and Cosmos and Psyche, Intimations of a New Worldview, as well as Robert Bella's Religion and Human Evolution from the Paleolithic to the Axial Age, and Karen Barad's Meeting the Universe Halfway, Quantum Physics and the Entanglement of Matter and Meaning. We'll also be drawing from Mary Trump's biography, Too Much and Never Enough, How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man, and Rutger Bregman's Humankind, A Hopeful History, as well as a bit from Bob Woodward's Rage, and less so from Jean Gebser's Ever-Present Origin and Jean Piaget's The Psychology of the Child. I bring rage out. I do bring rage out. I always have. I don't know if that's an asset or a liability, but whatever it is, I do. Candidate Trump in an interview with Bob Woodward, March 31st, 2016. The depths of his dishonesty is just astounding to me. The dishonesty, the transactional nature of every relationship, though it's more pathetic than anything else. He is the most flawed person I have ever met in my life. Former White House Chief of Staff, retired Marine General John Kelly. Now, I believe we can exchange wounded for flawed here, and the primary reason for that is the insights gleaned from Mary Trump's Too Much and Never Enough. So Mary Trump's biography was extremely helpful in identifying some of the details of the childhood wounds that he suffered. When he's about two and a half, his mother had a hysterectomy and she spent about a year in the hospital. And that formative developmental period, if one's needs aren't met, if one doesn't have adequate mirroring from a primary caregiver, one doesn't often develop a healthy level of empathy, and or a healthy level or sense of self-confidence and sense of genuine self-worth and the capacity to feel as though one belongs in any given situation. Because if we don't develop that relational capacities in early childhood, often the ego or the organism has compensatory actions that it does in order to secure its being. And I believe that the narcissism that we see in Donald Trump is a compensation for a lack of love that he experienced in early childhood. And so there's a deep hole there. There's a lacking, a wound, an empty space that craves a tremendous amount of love because it wasn't provided for him in early childhood. And so in a sense, the narcissism, it can never, it's like the wound is so deep and so profound that there's no level of adulation that he can gain from his rallies or whatnot that will actually ever satisfy what is a primal early childhood wound. Now, in addition to the narcissism, it seems as though there's two things. Like, his older brother was 7 years older and was psychologically tortured by his father because his father was a sociopath and was very patriarchal and named his eldest son Fred Jr. and assumed that Fred Jr. would become the heir to his empire, and basically tried to force him to be that person. And Fred Jr. was not that type of person. He wasn't the killer, instinctual killer of capitalist cutthroat economics to become what his father wanted him to be. And so he failed at that, and Donald, being 7 years younger, watched his older brother fail at becoming who his father wanted him to be, and he learned from his older brother's mistakes and became the killer that his father wanted his older brother to be, and then stepped into that role and became the heir to the empire. And there's one other point I'd like to make here, which is Donald had a younger brother who's 2.5 years younger, and because his mother didn't discipline Donald was allowed basically to torture his younger brother. And so throughout his life, Donald had like a 2-year-old younger brother that he could constantly kind of beat up on and was never held to account for that. In a sense, he developed the bullying that we see so clearly now. So it seems as though there's a real, special circumstances that produced the psychopathy or the sociopathy, the narcissism, and even the misogyny, like the difficult relationship with one's mother can indicate difficulties in relating to women throughout one's life. And particularly the sociopathy, it seems he adopted from his father's psychological orientation. And we'll explore that in just a second. So when I began my analysis of Donald Trump just after he got elected, I predicted he would be impeached. Now, I don't normally do predictions. I don't believe the future is set. It's a participatory relationship. It's a participatory process, co-creative, and the future isn't set, and archetypal astrology is not concretely predictive. It is archetypally predictive, but I felt as though because he had rose to political power on a racist lie, on the birtherism lie, and that so much of his history is filled with corruption, the Trump University, like all of these frauds. I mean, it's like he's a con man. He's constantly selling something that isn't real. And the fact that that was the nature of his relationship to Saturn, because Saturn is the archetype associated with the truth, with the facts, with the bottom line of reality, with consensus reality, what we agree upon are the facts. But also it corresponds to one's discipline and one's capacity to speak the truth and stay within their integrity. And the fact that he has such little integrity and had risen to power on a racist lie, I felt as though, relative to the transits that we will explore in just a minute, that there was no way he was going to be able to go through his presidency without being held to account in some way. So that was the way I felt about it, and I believe that is still accurate. So let's take a look at a couple of the important aspects in his natal chart. Trump is actually born about an hour before a lunar eclipse, meaning that the moon was passing through the shadow of the Earth, so it wouldn't have been visible just an hour or so after he was born. And what's really interesting to me about this is the moon corresponds to the mother, to the child in one's life. It's the mother-child dyad. So it's the mother in one, it's the childhood experience, and it's the mother-child relationship. And the relationship with one's mother is the primary relationship that we all have, and it is the relationship upon which the rest of our relationships are built. So it's the template for the way we relate to the world, and the moon, the lunar, is the lunar dimension of how we feel, how we emotionally respond, how we feel as though we belong, how we relate. It's the relational field. It corresponds to the relational field. And it's pretty instructive to realize that he's born, during an eclipse, and there is a giant shadow there. There is a void where one's mother wasn't as present as one would have liked her to have been in order to develop a healthy relational dynamic. Now, in addition to that, the sun is in conjunction with Uranus, which is a big part of his genius and kind of a erratic nature at times. But then it's supported by a trine, this most supportive aspect, from Jupiter, which is the most supportive planet. Jupiter tends towards support, good fortune, magnanimity, and you can see clearly that he has had a lot of good fortune in his life. The Jupiter-Uranus alignment from 17 Gemini to 17 Libra, that trine exactly, you often see with a gambler's type chart. It's like it's the capacity or orientation or tendency to have good fortune kind of suddenly arrive. Sudden is from Uranus, and the good fortune from Jupiter. And it seems as though that's been a big part of him getting out of trouble a lot. It's like the sudden, unexpected good fortune, like even winning the presidency was a Jupiter-Uranus moment. Now, one really important aspect in this chart is the fact that Mercury is in a square, a hard aspect, a challenging alignment to Neptune. Now, Mercury is the mind, the way we think, the way we process information, the way we communicate. And Neptune is the imagination. It's our own, it can be the collective imagination, but often it's one's own imagination, specifically when it's in connection to Mercury. So the way one thinks, the way one recognizes patterns, the way one communicates in his life has been challenged by Neptune in certain ways, where you can see the tendency to kind of go with the stream and flow of consciousness, the image, the imagination, and to kind of get lost in that and to spin, say things that maybe aren't grounded in consensus reality in Saturn's world, but are things that he believes are true in his own imagination, but aren't necessarily agreed upon by the rest of the world. And this seems to be a pretty strong part of his identity that is constantly spinning using image, and so much so that he's striving to have us believe the narrative that's happening in his mind. Now, another really, really important combination of aspects that he has is the fact that he's born with Mars rising. So the rising point, this is the horizon line where the sun would be if he was born at dawn. And whatever is at this position, if you're born with the planet at the rising position, it's what we lead with. The rising sign, it's what we kind of move into any given situation, the way people initially kind of see us. and often the way we initially instigate, the way we respond or act on the world. So for Donald Trump, Mars is there, and Mars is the warrior. It's our courage. It's that part of us that isn't afraid to leap out and say what one thinks. And if we go back to that initial statement where he says, "I bring rage out in people," well, Mars is the god of war and the archetype associated with anger, and he clearly has a temper, and he acts on it often. And it's interesting, there's a trine to the moon, which the moon is other people, the relational field, and it's really easy for him to just, let people have it. It's an innate intrinsic response almost. And that's in part because it's rising, it's right there in the immediate interaction, moment to moment, and it has this easy flow to other people and just, digging into their emotions and the way they feel. So it makes sense why other people would often feel enraged by his actions. Now, there's more to it than that. So I'd like to draw our attention to the Mars-Saturn-Pluto midpoint alignment in his natal chart. And what's taking place here is Pluto is exactly at the midpoint between Saturn and Mars. The midpoint is 10 degrees and 17 minutes Leo, and his natal Pluto is 10 degrees and 2 minutes Leo, so it's just 15 minutes off of an exact midpoint alignment. And what takes place in a midpoint arrangement is a fusion, a combination, an empowerment of all three archetypes to come through in a more potent way in one's life. Now, Saturn corresponds to the superego, our sense of right and wrong, Pluto to the id, the instinctual driving force of evolution, and Mars is the assertive will, our courage and the warrior, and at times the violent, overly assertive aspect of who we are. Now, I think what's important, what we can glean from this combination is highlighted in Rick Tarnas's Cosmos and Psyche. So as we read through this, think about Donald Trump's life experience and what you know of him and what we're learning here. So the psychodynamics underlying this interplay was insightfully depicted by Freud in his understanding of the superego's complex relationship to the id. The superego, as the internal principle of conscience, moral judgment, and instinctual constraint, carries in itself the fear of punitive retribution from the interjected parental authority. Freud recognized that the superego was not only repressive and punitive against the instinctual drives of the id, but was also energetically informed and impelled by the id, unconsciously from below, as it were, even when it perceived the nefarious threat to be from the outside. The psychological consequence could sometimes take the form of obsessive-compulsive and cruel, sadistic tendencies directed either internally against the self or externally against others, often both. The periods of such alignments seem to coincide with an emphatically increased tendency towards psychological splitting. For example, tending to view oneself as entirely identified with the good and the other entirely with evil. Closely associated with this mechanism of defense was an equally powerful tendency towards othering, the intense objectification of other subjects. This objectification, when combined with the projection or experience of evil and shadow qualities, tended to impel such emotions as violent suspicion, terror, hatred, revenge, fanaticism, and murderous cruelty. Such behavior and impulses seem to be made psychologically possible by establishing or experiencing an absolute boundary between the self and the other. The other, whether defined by nationality, religion, race, class, caste, gender, sexual orientation, belief system, or any other category, was then perceived as radically separate and alien, sometimes as subhuman and unworthy of life. The Freudian insight into the superego's hidden dual relation to the id can be deepened by the Jungian perspective in which the shadow, possessing the ego, but projected onto the other, enacts its cruelty against the object of its wrath with all the insidious destructiveness it perceives in the other and denies in itself. Now, this seems to be a very clear insight into a strong part of Donald Trump's complexes. Now, everyone has shadow. It's a part of the egoic consciousness to not be able to see certain aspects of one's identity. But it seems as though if one is denying parts of oneself that one doesn't want to see, the shadow grows. It gets larger and larger because it's being repressed and not being acknowledged. And it seems as though, in a combination with Donald Trump's early childhood wounds and this like just tremendous capacity for denial, that he has engendered a large shadow that is in essence, like Rick was saying, is possessing the ego and projected onto the other. And you see when Trump is attacking people, it's what he perceives as evil in the other is actually something he's denying in himself. Now, this is a really important insight to understand about the nature of the psychological dynamics between one's superego and one's instinctual id. And this is not just something that happens in Donald Trump's psyche. What we actually can recognize, and what Rick is saying here in this paragraph, when he says the periods of such alignment seem to coincide, he's talking about the outer planetary transits, Saturn-Pluto alignments in history for all of us, not just Donald Trump's birth chart. So we'll explore this in a minute when we look at the Saturn-Pluto cycle and the tendency for the collective psyche to move into psychological splitting during Saturn-Pluto time periods. So this has tremendous importance for us to be aware of, that we all are participating in the collective psyche at any given time, and that when there are Saturn-Pluto alignments or any other alignment, that we can be drawn into them and participate in them in unconscious ways that often can be unhealthy or not extremely life-enhancing, we'll say. So yeah, I think this is really important, and there are more details that we can unpack in this, but let's move along for now. Now, this is Fred Trump Sr.'s chart. I don't have a birth time, it's just for noon, but the point here is that Donald Trump Sr., Fred Trump Sr. was born with Saturn in a trine to the Sun and Mercury and to Pluto. So he has Pluto and Saturn in a harmonious relationship, really tight, with his Sun, his sense of self, his identity, and Mercury, the mind, the way he communicates and pattern recognition and acts through the mind. Now, what's interesting about this, this is the builder in him. Pluto intensifies and Saturn is organized and wants foundations and builds structures. And often you see with Pluto, Saturn people, particularly in a trine, is the capacity to build lots of things, to build strong foundations for, it can be psychological foundations, but for him it was actually a real estate empire. But what's really fascinating is when we look at the synastry. So what we're looking at here this is Donald Trump's natal chart on the inside and Fred Trump Sr.'s chart on the outside. And this is deeply fascinating because, to begin, Pluto, Fred Sr.'s Pluto, is exactly conjoining Donald Trump's Sun. So 22 degrees Gemini to 22 degrees Gemini. And then, as well, Fred Trump Sr.'s Sun is exactly conjoining Donald Trump's natal Jupiter, both at 17 degrees Libra. Now, another important aspect is Fred Trump Sr.'s Saturn is at 26 Aquarius, which is exactly opposite Donald Trump's Mars at 26 Leo. So what we can kind of gain insight into this is a couple of things, which is, the Saturn is also trine to Donald Trump's Sun. So the Saturn-Pluto part of Fred Trump Sr.'s psychology, which is his superego and his id, and the psychological sociopathy that's associated with that in his being, is right on Donald Trump's Sun. So he's getting a really intense version, and it makes a lot of sense why he adopted his father's psychological disposition so directly and so kind of clearly, it seems. So I feel like this was a really important insight to understand the nature of their relationship and potentially why Donald Trump was so influenced by his father's will. Now, this is really fascinating. Fred Trump Jr. Had a Mars-Neptune conjunction. So Mars, the warrior, is in a alignment conjunction with the planet Neptune, which, like I was saying before, is it's the imagination. It's the stream and flow of consciousness. It actually corresponds to the ocean, and what you actually see with Mars-Neptune people often is more of a compassionate sensibility, where Mars, the warrior, is softened by Neptune, because Neptune is the great mother goddess, and it's the imagination and dreams and one's ideals, and it tends to make sensitive whatever it's in relationship with. And in this case, Mars, making it more compassionate, more empathetic, more sensitive. And you often see Mars Neptune with like people who like to be on the ocean, who like to go swimming. Lots of swimmers have Mars Neptune. And this is something that seems to be a part of his psychological makeup, that he would rather spend time boating and with his friends, doing more passive things rather than being the killer that Donald Trump became with his Mars rising and his Mars-Saturn-Pluto alignment, which is much more of a robust Mars energy. So it's very, very fitting. Also, Fred Trump Jr.'s sun was opposite natal Saturn, which you often see with complicated relationships with parental authorities. Saturn relates to the authority figures. And when one has that, it can indicate challenging dynamics between one and authority figures. So I've been really focusing on the shadow dimensions, just for clarity of all of these aspects. Every combination, every planetary combination and aspect has noble and less noble expressions. Donald Trump's chart does not produce the psychopathology that we see. It's a participatory relationship. It's how we embody the chart as to how it is expressed. And it seems as though it's Donald Trump's wounds in childhood that have led largely to the shadow embodiment of what otherwise could be really noble alignments. Now, this is deeply fascinating. So John Lewis has Mars conjunct Saturn in a square with Pluto. It's what could be the same type of psychological splitting and othering that we see in Donald Trump. This is a great example of how it can come through in a very noble way, not in a way that is pathological or debilitating to one's society. And the way it came through in his experience was the Mars warrior with the courage to stand up for what's right, Saturn, the superego, what's right, in the face of intense, overwhelming violence from Pluto. And he put himself in harm's way over and over again, but he did it for the noble side of Saturn. He did it for a higher good, for the greater good, for ultimately for the beloved community. It's interesting, he also has Mercury and Neptune in alignment, where Donald Trump has the square and it comes through in more of a challenging relationship. John Lewis had an opposition, which could be just as challenging, but came through in his experience as the minister. This is the person whose mind is focused on the transcendent good, on the Neptunian vision, the imagination, our aspirations, what our highest ideals could be. Neptune wanting to Neptune corresponds to the underlying unity of reality and wants that beloved community in the highest possible aspiration of what is noble or good. So I'm just putting that out there as a good counterbalance, as a very direct counterbalance to someone who has very similar aspects in their natal chart, but embodies them in a very, very different way. And this is what's really important, one of the most important things to understand about the nature of archetypes and the nature of astrological participation is multivalence. Every archetypal complex has an extremely wide range of possible manifestations, and that is the multivalent nature of that archetype's potential for expression. Many different possibilities, and it is in large ways up to us as to how we embody those archetypes with our will, with our agency. So another couple of examples here. Anthony Fauci, actually born with Mercury square Neptune, the same exact alignment that Donald Trump has, definitely not coming through in the tendency towards exaggeration or pathological lying. Instead, my guess is he has a sensitive mind and potentially interest in poetry or transcendent art, or has like a sublime sense of beauty in his the way he perceives beauty in his artistic eye. Now, this is Bob Dylan's chart. He also has Mercury square Neptune, and you can see in his life experience, it came through as the poet. Mercury being the writer, and Neptune the imagination, and he's just constantly inspired with, poem, lyric, song after song after song. So, really fascinating how it can come through in just absolutely life-enhancing ways, rather than really challenging, negotiating the nature of reality, the facts of reality, and the way it comes through in Trump's chart. What's also really interesting here is Dylan is born with Sun, Jupiter, Uranus triple conjunction, which Donald Trump has the Sun-Uranus conjunction trine Jupiter. So, but you don't see the same inflated sense of hubris and narcissism that we see in Donald Trump. I mean, clearly there's, I'm sure, a high level of inflation and narcissism, but or maybe not narcissism, but in Bob Dylan, but it's restrained. He has a Moon-Saturn conjunction, and it's kept a little bit on the inside in that sense. Fascinating. Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, also had Mercury opposite Neptune, and you see in his life experience that coming through with in imagination as a storyteller, and also preaching to kids, like where John Lewis was a preacher to chickens in his early life, but Mr. Rogers went to ministry school, I believe, and decided to conduct a children's program, in essence, to bring what he considered the ministry to children. And it's fascinating. It's also in a conjunction with Venus and the moon, which the moon is children. And really interesting, Mr. Rogers also had Sun-Uranus conjunction with Jupiter, like Dylan, and the trine with Trump. And so, again, not an inflated, arrogant, narcissistic person, but yet a person that has good fortune and a creative impulse to kind of constantly make things new. That's one way in which the Jupiter-Uranus combination comes through. Because Uranus wants the new, and Jupiter can expand that orientation. So the constant kind of restlessness to create and make new is a big part of the way that combination can come through. And you see that in Trump, it's restlessness and constantly making things new, but it's a much more scattered, less directed energy. So now what we're going to do here is look at the Saturn cycle in Donald Trump's life relative to how he has been held to account for his actions or the lack thereof. Now, what's really interesting about this is what we're looking at is the outer wheel is the transits, is Donald Trump's transits, and this is Donald Trump's natal chart on the inside again. And so what happens is the Saturn cycle makes a quadrature alignment every 7 years. So the first square happens between 6 and 8, and then the opposition between 13 and 15, the second square between 20 and 22, and then it comes back to where it was when you were born. This is what's called the Saturn return, between 28 and 30. And this is the maturational cycle. Saturn has to do with maturity, the superego, the introduced parental figures, and how we are aligning ourselves with that, and how we are also differentiating from it and creating our own sense of authority and moving into our own adulthood. So what we can see here is that when Donald Trump was 7 years old, there's a famous story where he was not being held to account. He was abusing his younger brother to the point where his mother could not contain him, could not control him. And I guess his father couldn't either, or wasn't trying to. And what happened was they're at the dinner table, and I guess Donald Trump won't relent in his torturing of his younger brother. And his older brother, Freddie Jr., took a bowl of mashed potatoes and dumped it on his head. And this is a tremendous sense of shame for Donald Trump that he still is burdened by, according to Mary Trump, that when it's brought up even today, he still cannot laugh at it. He still cannot move into a healthy dynamic with it. He still feels ashamed by the experience. And it comes back to this toxic positivity is the way that Mary Trump describes it, which is another term for denial. When toxic positivity is always thinking it's good with that you're denying that there's anything bad. So it's a combination of those two principles in essence. And so this is like his first, real shameful experience there where he feels shame and still can't handle it. So at the next alignment, Saturn is moving into the opposition, and they send him to military school. Mother couldn't control him, father couldn't control him, and so they send him to military school in order to be disciplined. And this happened right when Saturn was beginning to move into the opposition. So during that 3 or 4 year period, Saturn was in the opposition for the first 2 years or so of it, and he developed that differentiation and more autonomy, and came back beginning to become the killer that his father wanted him to be. And the next alignment, Saturn here at 23 degrees Aries, tight square to natal Saturn at 23 Cancer, is when Donald Trump had just graduated from the military school and took a job with his father at Trump Org. Now, the next alignment is the Saturn return. This is just the very beginning, 20-degree orb of the very beginning of his Saturn return. And the organization is sued by the Department of Justice. And this is where he meets Roy Cohn and learns from Roy Cohn to never back down. I mean, he's probably already doing that, but learns it even more, to never back down and to attack, to relentlessly attack if one is being attacked. This was Roy Cohn's MO, and what they did was they sued the federal government, countersued the federal government for the suit that they had. And I'm not sure exactly how it worked out. I think there was a settlement, and he didn't get as in trouble as he probably should have been, and weaseled his way out on some level and paid some minuscule fine. Now, interestingly, this is Roy Cohn's natal chart, and what is he born with? Sun square Mars, which is opposite Saturn, and Sun square Saturn. This is a 6-degree square, a little wide, but it's there. So he's born with the Sun, Mars, Saturn, T-square, and Mars is in a semi-square to Pluto. So what do we have in Roy Cohn? We have the same Mars, Saturn, Pluto alignments that correspond to psychological splitting, denial, and othering, projection of the other onto the other of the things that we fear in ourselves and don't want to acknowledge in ourselves. And specifically, the Mars-Saturn alignment corresponds to kind of the reactionary impulse to attack. Because Saturn is our defenses, and if we feel like we're being attacked, and Mars is there, there's a reactionary, if you hit me, I hit back. It's like a lot of boxers have it. I think Mike Tyson has the Mars-Saturn alignment. So it's this is a strong impulse that clearly Donald Trump resonated with in Roy Cohn, and they became good friends and buddies in crime in a lot of ways, partners in crime. And fascinating, Norman Vincent Peale, who was the source of the toxic positivity, Trump is said to have gone to the school of Roy Cohn and the school of Norman Vincent Peale. And what's interesting is Norman Vincent Peale also has Sun conjunct Pluto opposite Saturn and Saturn in a sesquiquadrate to Mars, and Mars in the semi-square to the Sun. So again, we have the same archetypal dynamics working towards splitting, denial, othering, and constantly thinking that one should grow in a outward way. I mean, I think where the positive thinking comes in is Mercury is the mind, the way one thinks, is in a sesquiquadrate to Jupiter. Jupiter is the positivity, the upliftment, and if it's too much, it becomes toxic. So the power of positive thinking would be a Jupiter aspect, in this case, to Mercury, to the mind. So back to the chronology. Now this is a really important moment because this is just after his Saturn return. So it's the first Saturn square after he had kind of become an adult. He's about 35, 36 at this point. And what's happening, a couple of things. He gets his gaming license, which is his first real step beyond his father's domain, because his father was actually a conservative builder in the sense that he always built the same type of projects and never really expanded into like Manhattan and that type of thing, which Donald really wanted to do and did. But what's interesting about this moment is this is where he really, steps out and takes a real risk. And Saturn is square to itself. Really interesting, Pluto in the sky, 24 degrees Libra, is 1 degree square to his natal Saturn, which corresponds to the potential for really difficult experience and tremendous loss. But what's another really intriguing dynamic to this is it was just 7 years later that he has his first bankruptcy, which is amazing. And it's not like, so what happens is Saturn had moved to the square from where it was when he got the gaming license 7 years later, and it was opposing itself, and he has his first bankruptcy. Now, one really important aspect to this is where Saturn is today. So this is the Saturn return for the first time that Donald Trump was held accountable for his corrupt actions. Now, right now, Saturn in the sky is at 25 degrees Capricorn. So it's right back to where it was when he actually was held to account for the first time in his life. Now, let's explore a little more. This is 2011, the White House Correspondence dinner that Barack Obama held and Donald Trump attended and was roasted by Obama. And if you see the film, again, Donald Trump is there like extremely uncomfortable, basically smiling with difficulty, not really enjoying the fact that he was being humiliated by Barack Obama. Now, there are a lot of people who've speculated that this is part of what led him to running, but irrespective of that, he had already engaged in the birther lie at this point. And it's interesting that Saturn, it was in a square to Pluto in the sky. So like I was saying before, when Saturn and Pluto come into alignment in the collective, we have a tendency to collectively move into more psychological splitting. I'll give you examples. Like World War I, Saturn-Pluto conjunction, lots of splitting and othering, go to war against each other. World War II, square, 1939 to 1941. The Vietnam War is a Saturn-Pluto opposition. 9/11, Saturn-Pluto opposition. What is Bush comes out and says, you're either with us or you're against us. It happened again in the 2011, 2012 period. And it was the surge in Afghanistan. I can't really point to like a lot of othering specifically that happened then. I'm sure there was. I mean, there was the Syrian civil war and the refugee crisis that happened there. And and the othering towards immigrants that was happening in Europe. Clearly, lots of splitting, psychological splitting and othering that was taking place by Europeans to immigrants coming from the Middle East. Yeah, but what we can see here is that this is the point where he took up the birther lie, and this was the Tea Party kickback moment from the 2010 elections with Saturn-Pluto as well, was the conservative kickback to Obama's election. So the Tea Party is a conservative reaction to the first black president. And Trump was right on board with that. Now, here's the 2016 election. I'm not going to go into detail. If you want to hear details on this, I'll put it in the link from my 2018 talk. But basically, he had super good fortune, unexpected good fortune, where the Jupiter-Uranus that I mentioned that has that gambler's luck, it was happening in the sky. Uranus was opposite his natal Jupiter. Jupiter was returning to where it was when he was born, and Uranus was sextile to the sun. This is a 60-degree alignment from 21 Aries to 22 Gemini. And so there's multiple factors or resonant effects where he's born with the Jupiter-Uranus, it's in the sky, and it's aligning with his natal Jupiter-Uranus alignment. So it makes sense for the sudden unexpected good fortune to take place then, and that's certainly what happened. He wasn't even expecting to win himself. So now we get into the presidency, we get some really, really interesting alignments corresponding, or events corresponding to the eclipses that took place during his presidency. Now, specifically, there's eclipses surrounding the Charlottesville incident, the Helsinki incident, and the Ukraine incident, the perfect phone call where he was actually impeached. So let's take a look at it real quick. This is 10 days after the Charlottesville incident. So it's a solar eclipse at 28 degrees Leo, which is on his ascendant and on his Mars, in which Mars is the warrior principle, the aggressive, the assertive, potentially antagonistic aspect of who we are. Now, the eclipse itself, astrologer Dale O'Brien pointed this out, where the path of the eclipse, the red line, it begins crosses Lincoln City, Oregon, crosses Lincoln, Nebraska, and then crosses Fort Sumter, South Carolina, which is where the Civil War began. And the fact that this happened 10 days after the Charlottesville incident, and Trump came out and sanctioned good people on both sides, this speaks a lot to the shadow revelation of the racist undercurrents or underbelly of the American psyche. It seems as though our racist shadow was brought to the surface in ways that it had not been for many decades, really. And honestly, this is a healthy thing, ultimately, that we are engaged in shadow work, that we're engaged in working with our shadow, facing it. And this is part of the gift that Trump is blessing us with, that he's keeping it in front of us. He's such an embodiment of shadow material that we can't not see it. And hopefully we're going to learn a lot more from his actions. So now, this is March 15th of 2018. Mary Trump gets the family taxes. And the ramifications of this potentially are going to be profound. She is suing him. I'll get into the details of what happened. So this is where Mary Trump acquires the family taxes. Now, something I forgot to mention just a second ago, which is when during the bankruptcy, the first bankruptcy, at this point, what actually happened in addition to the bankruptcy was Donald Trump actually tried to steal his father's empire. He tried to steal it not only from his father, but from his siblings as well. He sent a codicil to his father through a lawyer, trying to get him to sign it. And if he had have signed it, he would have signed away his entire estate. And Donald Trump was doing this because his father was starting to slip into dementia, into Alzheimer's, and he was attempting to steal the empire, partly because he's going bankrupt, but also because he did not want to have his father die and then have to pay the inheritance taxes, which he'd have to pay like 50% on what was like $1 billion empire or something like that, or maybe it was hundreds of millions of dollars. It was a lot, and he tried to steal it from his father and from his siblings, and he got caught by his father and his siblings. And instead of like, shaming him and whatever, they actually decided it was a good idea, and they developed a shell company called All County, and they funneled the estate into the siblings' accounts so that they would not have to pay income taxes on it. So it ended up becoming a scam born out of Donald Trump's betrayal of his family. So more lack of Saturn betrayal. Just need to throw that in there. So what happens is eventually Mary Trump gets cheated out of her share of the inheritance because they maligned her father, Fred Trump Jr., so much that they did not see him as worthy of what would be an equal share of the inheritance because he had drank himself to death. So they cheated Mary Trump and her brother out of, I think, a couple $100 million, because I think they gave her 30 million, but that was because they told her, I'm not sure, but they valued the estate at many times less what it was actually worth. And she got cheated out of what should have been her inheritance. And now she's suing him for it. And I think she'll win. So this is more part of what's happening. Pluto is opposing natal Saturn at this point. This is where Pluto is just moving into a 3-degree orb for opposition to natal Saturn. And the karma is catching up with him relative to his corrupt actions, his lack of integrity related to his relationship to Saturn. Now, this is probably the most, after the Charlottesville incident, the Helsinki moment was where, people who were in the government, who had held on, who were still trying to give Trump the benefit of the doubt, that were in any way involved in intelligence and the bureaucratic systems of the government, basically recognized at this moment that he's full traitor. He betrayed the United States directly on international television, siding with Vladimir Putin over his own intelligence agents. And the eclipse happened at 20 degrees Cancer, which is just 3 degrees off of his natal Saturn. So what it seems we can see, the symbolism is there's a shadow revelation of relating specifically to his relationship to Saturn, his lack of integrity again. So, and then the next one was the Ukraine incident where the perfect phone call, which again is a Mercury function, the call, and the eclipse took place at 10 degrees Cancer, just 2 degrees off of his natal Mercury. And the Saturn-Pluto conjunction is becoming tight at this point, and Pluto is just 1 degree in the opposition to Saturn. So the karmic consequence is kind of tightening in that vice of an experience. And then another really interesting moment where the actual day of the call, on the 25th, is the eclipse was about 3 weeks early, but on the day of the call, Mercury is, I think, retrograde, but either way, it's exactly conjoining his natal Saturn, just 2 degrees off. And what you see often with Mercury-Saturn alignments is communication error or a decision that's made that has tremendous consequences. Saturn is the consequences of our actions, and it can often corresponds to an important decision being made, sometimes a mistake, but either way, a decision where the consequences of that decision last for longer than they otherwise would if you weren't in relationship to Saturn. Now, this is where it really everything is so interesting. But on January 28th, 2020, the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, I believe, in a daily presidential briefing, told Trump that the emerging virus in China was going to be the biggest threat to his presidency. He did not heed that warning the way he should have, and the tragic results are now evident in the United States. In addition to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction being, exactly opposite natal Saturn, this is about as tight as it gets. Neptune is beginning to square his natal, squaring Uranus, but it's beginning to square his sun. And this is going to happen for the next 4 years or so. And it seems as though potentially what's happening is Neptune can dissolve the boundaries or weaken the vitality of the sun in essence. And one can become less grounded and more delusional. One can get caught up into the imagination, into the stream and flow of consciousness, and not have a grounded sense of identity, and can act in ways that are less grounded, less attached to reality, less in touch with the Saturnian consensus. And I think we're seeing that. I think we're going to see more of it as the weeks and months progress. So this is a Facebook post I made on January 26th, 2 days before that meeting. And I said, I've read contraindicating reports about the Wuhan coronavirus. It wasn't named COVID at that point. It didn't happen until February. So contraindicating reports about the Wuhan coronavirus. Yesterday, I read in the Washington Post that the CDC recognizes the viral structure to be similar to SARS virus from 2002, and they are ahead of a typical timeline for analysis, and they felt they may be able to develop a vaccine within 3 months. Who knows if that was any way accurate at that early stage. But today I read Chinese scientists suggest the virus is mutating rapidly, which could complicate and prolong the epidemic. I just want to point out, I said, I just want to briefly point out that the SARS outbreak in 2002 occurred during the last Saturn-Pluto opposition from 2000 to 2004, and now the Wuhan coronavirus during the current conjunction. And I said, it is worth noting that the Black Plague, which killed a third of the European population from 1347 to 1353, occurred during the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of April 1348 to February 1352. Now, I said, I'm not predicting a major pandemic, just pointing out the correlations. Now, when I look back on this, I feel like I dropped the ball in many ways, because if I had read more thoroughly and more deeply at that time, Cosmos and Psyche, what I would have recognized in the evidence there is the actual initial outbreak of the Black Plague in the 1330s happened in 1333 in China, when Saturn was opposite Pluto, just like the SARS-CoV-1 outbreak in 2002 occurred during a Saturn-Pluto opposition, the same one that corresponds to 9/11. And then it was 20 years later, during the next conjunction, that the Black Plague moved into Europe and ended up killing a third of the population. Now, if I had recognized that and made the connections, I think I would have been a little bit more worried or conscientious of the fact that the new coronavirus could actually become a pandemic. Now, what's important about this is that, from what I understand now as well, epidemiologists around the world, many were suggesting that we should start making coronavirus vaccines after the first SARS outbreak, because they expected more coronaviruses to zootropically jump species and potentially create a pandemic, and that we would have been ahead of the game if we had moved in that direction. Now, basically what we can see here is that there is a capacity to prepare for potential downturns. Of course, we couldn't have predicted that it would have happened, but if we know it may be more of a possibility at certain time periods, we can prepare for them. Just give you a quick example economically. It's like if we knew there was a potential downturn, which you do see economic downturns with Saturn-Pluto periods, that maybe you don't put in a $2 trillion tax cut for the uber wealthy, because it weakens your capacity to handle a problem when it occurs. Again, how the practical aspects of how this method of insight can be genuinely helpful for how we navigate our relationship to the Earth and to the future. So, back to the chronology. On April 23rd, in the last task force briefing up until July, Trump decided to suggest injecting bleach into the human body to cure the coronavirus, which clearly is an absurd idea. And the fact that he mused it just shows the level of disconnect that is happening in his psyche. Now, what I want to point out here is that Mercury was retrograde and it was square to his natal Saturn. Just like when the perfect call happened, Mercury was conjoining natal Saturn. Now, I just looked up, and it's interesting. This is exactly where Mercury was when he fired James Comey, which led to the Russian investigation. So again, you see poor decisions that have lasting consequences. It couldn't be more clear, really. So here's a small list of the things he has done. He denied the severity of the virus, failed to implement any adequate testing and tracing, delayed the shutdown till March 16th, pitted states against one another, sued governors for the mandates that they were implementing, called for public uprisings against those governors to open their economies, liberate Michigan, which clearly has instigated even potential violence towards Governor Whitmer. He tried to extort the schools, blackmail the schools into opening, threatening to withhold funding from them if they didn't reopen. Asinine. 220,000 people have died and counting. The projections are maybe we're going to double this by the spring of next year. Of course, it has not magically disappeared, and he denies any responsibility. Again, just the level of denial in him it's the most profound I've ever seen in a human being. So much so that even catching it himself, facing death, he has not been able to relinquish that denial and allow himself to recognize the serious situation that we're all in. Now, this is 3 days before George Floyd was killed, and this whole several month or 2 month period is marked by a series of lunar eclipse and solar eclipse. But what's happening is Mars is square to the sun the entire time. So it's square to the new moon on May 22nd. Then on June 1st, he attacks the peaceful protesters in Lafayette Park. Mars square Uranus, Mars square the moon. And this was just before, 4 days before lunar eclipse happened right on his moon, sun, with Mars exactly square to the moon and the sun in the sky, which this was clearly like a really heightened period where there was a lot of Mars antagonistic energy back and forth between all parties in essence. Now then the Tulsa rally was actually the day, I think it was on the 20th, it was the day before the solar eclipse, which the solar eclipse was exactly in his midpoint between Sun and Mercury, which is part of his solar identity and his decision making. And I think we can clearly say that this event led directly to the death of Herman Cain and probably others. And what he's doing now with the continued rallies simply for his narcissistic needs is leading to the deaths and of people and much further spread of the virus and a much longer course of disease for the nation because more and more people are getting infected. And okay, so on March 9th, I predicted that Trump would lose the election. And I basically said that Biden would have to forget where he is on stage in order for Trump to win. It would have to be something along that level because of the way Trump was actually handling the virus. It was clear to me in March that it was going to be a disaster and he probably wouldn't be able to get elected. And what I actually said really specifically about that was because he's in this Saturn transit. Saturn is it's been opposing his natal Saturn, which is a karmic moment. And specifically what I said was that because Mars had moved as far as 1 degrees Aquarius, and it was moving retrograde back to its last opposition, its last within orb station of the opposition to natal Saturn. And often what I've seen, and Rick has commented on before, is that when if you don't integrate the lesson that's being asked of you by Saturn in this case, of how you show up in relationship to what's important, what's responsible, your integrity, doing what the consensus needs done relative to the facts of the situation. If you avoid that and you don't actually integrate what Saturn is asking of you, it's often at this point, at the last station during any aspect, at the last stationary point when it's in within orb, that the consequences really come in. That one is given an event, or experiences an event that is reflective of one's denial and one's inability to meet the moment and step up and actually integrate what Saturn is asking of one in a healthy way. And because he wasn't able to do that, he literally caught the virus the same week that Saturn stationed in its final opposition to itself. And another thing, this was the day of the debates, and Mars in the sky was exactly square to natal Saturn and square to his Saturn as well. So it's square to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in the sky and square to his natal Saturn. And what did we see? We saw the bully on steroids, and before he took the steroids, but he was in a position where he was possessed by shadow, Plutonic shadow, and Mars was attacking everything. He was attacking the moderator. He was attacking every question that happened. It was relentless. And it's, in a sense, it was like everything that happened in that moment, he perceived as a slight, as an attack on him. And what was he doing? Immediately reacting and attacking. That's what I was saying. It's the Mars-Saturn energy. And he had it double time. I mean, it's absolutely clear what was taking place on that debate stage relative to his transits. Now, this is the election that we're about to move into. And there's a lot we can say about this. There's clearly a lot of anxiety in the air relative to Trump's continued, marginalizing of the election, calling into question the validity and the call for what seems to be violence surrounding the election, that he wants his supporters to come out and show up, and he won't call for a peaceful transition. So clearly, a lot of this energy is in the sky. Mars will still be in the square to Jupiter and Pluto. It's just 7 degrees. It's retrograde. It'll stay in this square to this alignment through January. Oh, and one other thing is Mercury is stationing direct, so it's potent, and it's also square to his natal Saturn. So again, we're likely to see decisions that he makes that will have lasting negative consequences, just like a perfect call and suggesting injecting bleach. These are other Mercury-Saturn alignments that we just covered. So yeah, we'll take a look at this more in a second. So this is from Trump and Bob Woodward's final interview. Trump says, "You don't understand me," he said. "You don't understand me, but that's okay. You'll understand me after the election, but you don't understand me now. I don't think you get it, and that's okay." Now, I found this, rather cryptic, and I think it's actually really important to understand that after the election on December 14th, which is, I believe, the day the election gets certified, but there's a solar eclipse. It's a total solar eclipse. It takes place at 23 degrees Sagittarius, which is 2 degrees off of his natal moon and just 1 degree from the opposition to his sun. Now, as we have seen, the eclipses throughout his presidency have been very indicative of certain qualities of his psyche and certain qualities of those moments relative to his actions that we've seen. So what a solar eclipse on one's moon and sun would indicate to me is a potential for shadow revelation surrounding one's full identity, the sun and the moon, how one relates to the world. Like, this is the core parts of who we are, the sun and the moon. And the fact that there's a total solar eclipse during the transition, exactly aligned with his sun and moon, and we're seeing already tremendous shadow projection. I mean, he's like the master of shadow projection. But, what we may see here, this is a extremely volatile potential combination. So I'm no predictions, no concrete predictions. I was actually going to say, like, if you wanted me to guess on like, the hyperbolic potentials or whatever, I was actually thinking like maybe he would leave the country. And he actually suggested that the other day, that he's actually thinking he may leave. And the reason he would leave is because he is in legal trouble for tax evasion and for stealing the money from his niece and the Stormy Daniels payment and blah, blah, blah. It just goes on, I think. But anyway, those are really, I think, very fascinating, really intriguing, very potentially very helpful insights that we can gain. And I just want to state a couple of things about everything that we just looked at. So the hard problem of consciousness is multiple things, but one of them is why. Why does consciousness exist? Consider the hard problem. It's like, how is considered the easy problem? It's not easy. But why? Why do we have consciousness at all? Well, I don't know about that answer exactly. I have a couple of guesses, but another way that the hard problem of consciousness is described is the division between first and third person perspectives. So the idea would be, how can we relate the first person experience, say like what it feels like to be angry, to someone else, or what the taste of an apple is like, that type of thing. And of course, we're never going to get there on any absolute level, which we shouldn't. But I do believe that what we've just looked at, and when we look at astrological natal alignments, but transit analysis, what we're perceiving on some level is the interiority of the psyche. And what I was just saying before about the Saturn-Pluto's alignments in the collective, which we'll explore just now in a second, how the human psyche, the individual human mind, is participating in the collective psyche, which is reflected by the planetary alignments. So, is psyche in the brain? No. Is it that the brain is connected to psyche? Maybe. It kind of makes a lot of sense that we're inside of psyche rather than it being inside of the brain. And having this level of analysis potentially allows for at least a partial bridge between first and third person perspectives, I believe. Now, this is the most speculative thing I'll talk about, and we'll make it short. Karen Barad's agential realism is a very promising theory on the nature of reality, which describes, I'm not going to do it justice, but that basically every agent is we're an embedded participant in reality, and every action, everything we do is a co-creative process and creates the reality that we experience. So that the realism that occurs is a co-created process and corresponds to the boundaries that we create in our expression. How we relate to the world, how we define ourselves in relationship is an agential performative expression that is in some way co-creating the reality that we experience. In that same sense that we're embedded participants, not separate from the universe. Now, this is the most speculative thing I'll say, I think, which is she proposes a diffraction methodology, I think building on Donna Haraway's ideas. And specifically, it's related in her description or manifestation or theory of it is that diffraction is a process like the double slit experiment where we see the waves of light or waves of water or whatever that they diffract off of each other, and where they line up, there's amplifications where the waves cross, and then there's called cancels out in the troughs. But where the waves crest together, we're actually seeing more clarity of the nature of reality relative to the disparate parts. So like, in essence, diffraction can be a way to refine and bring more precision to our perception, the way that we see the world. And she's proposing diffraction methodology as a way to actually to scientifically study things that are traditionally beyond the realm of science. And I'm really enthusiastic about this because I actually think there's a way in which we can develop a diffraction methodology that would help us understand the nature of astrological phenomena and to be able to verify it in a sense, or bring it to life in a real way through our observations, through our diffraction capacities to make sense of the world, to describe it, to articulate what we see. And then basically if we have enough people, say 1,000 other astrologers, doing the same type of analysis, where we overlap and then where the shadows fall away, where they don't overlap, we'll end up with a boundary, in a sense, that allows us to see that as some form of true reality, that many people have seen the same thing and can recognize it as such. So again, super speculative. Don't know if it has any real validity, but I'm very inspired by the idea right now. So now, this is the second narrative. We're going to briefly look at the evolution of consciousness. Now, this is a mandala that is inspired by Richard Tarnas's work. He has a much more refined version of this, and he's writing a book about this. And I'm taking insights from it and projecting a lot of my own stuff on top of it. So this isn't the way he would do it in any way. This is my interpretation of his mandala. And I am adding, he would never say the psychological individuation of humanity. That is my projection onto it. He would just describe it as the evolution of worldviews, or the evolution of consciousness. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because what we can recognize, and this can help us understand what's happening in our moment at this time, which is we've moved from a hunter-gatherer, primal, instinctual, embedded, participatory understanding of the nature of reality and the nature of the human being through an evolution of consciousness through the archaic period, through the axial period at the 6th century, which is where religion and philosophy emerge, to the modern scientific era, where we basically eclipsed the religions and the secular age is born out of the Copernican revolution and the scientific revolution, and then move into the postmodern. And we can kind of, like Rick has described this as the movement from myth to philosophy and religion to psychology. Not just like a overly simplified way to understand it, but it's accurate, and it's important that we make sense of this on some level. If we take a look at the primal worldview, this is 250,000 years, the birth of Homo sapiens, up to 10,000 years ago, which is roughly when agriculture began and the earliest civilizations took place. And what we can recognize about this worldview is that the self, the human being, the human agent, had a permeable sense of identity. We did not see ourselves as separate, autonomous individuals with personal agency in the same way that we do now. And we didn't perceive ourselves as, literally separate and cut off from nature. It was much more of an embedded participation mystique, as it's been called. And what I want to show here is that there is an evolution that we can recognize that would reflect the evolution of one single human lifetime. And this would be like infancy consciousness, right? So we're literally, you're lying on your back, you're immersed, you're looking up at mom, but you can't, you're just flailing around, you don't have any agency, you can't even sit upright. So you're just completely immersed, embedded, and participant in the nature of reality. And then we move into the archaic civilizations where everything was focused on the pharaoh or the chief. This is like just the earliest civilizations where we're basically organizing the beginnings of a city state, and all of the focus is on the chief or the pharaoh as being the mediator to the transcendent. Just to go back here, like the blue is meaning and purpose and intention and intelligence, and it was perceived to be in the world and in the self, and there was a continuum that took place. And then when we move into the archaic, it becomes less so here and more focused on the chief or the pharaoh and that type of thing. And this is what we call pre-toddler consciousness, where we are sitting upright, but we're not yet a toddler. We can't move, we can't crawl around yet. We're just sitting upright, and we're organizing the bodily functions, right? Just the same way that you would organize a city-state. It's just a matter of like getting together how the physical organism works. And this is 10,000 BC roughly to the 6th century. And what's interesting is the astrological perspective here was just omens and stuff for the whole, for the society. It was seen for the, for the tribe, for the civilization, for the community, and perhaps for the chief, for the pharaoh, but not for individuals. And when we get to the axial era, this is one of the most profound moments in history, where Thales in ancient Greece, the beginning of philosophy, the Buddha, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Ezekiel and Isaiah, Mahavira, Sappho emerges at this moment with the first person lyric poetry, and the emergence of Western science and philosophy, and particularly the emergence of second order thinking. So thinking about thinking, philosophy. Why are we thinking the thoughts we're thinking? Rather than like, the idea in a sense would be that, our actions and everything prior to the 6th century, that like there wasn't the same reflexivity about what was happening within one's experience. We didn't necessarily question our actions in the same way that we would emerging in at this period. So the understanding of an I and the thou become prominent at this moment in history. And what's interesting is this is where we have our first birth charts from 410 BC. Prior to this, we don't have individual birth charts. We just have like astronomical positions and calculations, but nothing that focuses on an individual. And probably the most deeply fascinating aspect about this period in history is that it's the only time in written history when the 3 outer planets that were yet discovered were all 3 in the same place. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were in a triple conjunction from 600 to 560 BC, and it corresponds to a radical emergence of a spiritual orientation with a Plutonic evolutionary, momentous, powerful instantiation, a Plutonic, evolutionary will that Uranianly revealed a new vision of the heavens and the human being in that relationship. And this is, I believe, we're going to recognize this to be a really important connection relative to the history of the evolution of consciousness. And I don't think it's an accident that those three planets were in the same place in the sky, and we had this cross-cultural emergence of philosophy and religion. Now, on the toddler-child consciousness, this is interesting because, if you got first-person critical self-awareness and you're thinking about thinking, it's the same as having some autonomy and moving into your own agency. And that's where you become a toddler, and you can crawl around, and you become a child, and you can direct your own agency, your own will to life. Now, the modern era is defined in large ways by the Copernican revolution. In many ways, because up until this point in history, everyone, all the religious perspectives, every mode of knowing, assumed that we were the center of the universe, that the earth was fixed, motionless, and everything else was rotating around us as the center of meaning and purpose. And when the human mind figured out that that wasn't the truth, this is when we basically eclipse the religions, in essence, and the secular age is born, because the human mind figured out a mystery that none of the religions had been able to see. And this corresponds to a tremendous empowerment of the self. And you can see what happens is we internalize all of the meaning and purpose in the world that we saw in nature and in the heavens prior to that. We localize it here, and the human mind, the human being, becomes superior to God. That we think we have all the intelligence in the known universe, in essence. And we've created this strong boundary between the modern self and the natural world. And this has a lot of really important aspects too, which is prior to this period, it was often seen that like the gods were making you do things. When someone would have a aberrative experience or something, it's like, oh, the god possessed them, and that type of thing. And it was a consideration that was always happening, that you were being informed by the gods. But then when we build this kind of buffered self, this that we're separate from nature, that we have our own autonomy, and those spirits and stuff aren't real. Ultimately, it's an empowering psychological development in the evolution of consciousness, and creates a more autonomous self that has more agency and more capacity to direct one's life. Now, it has lots of really important dimensions to it, but of course there's a giant shadow that can be created here, where if one thinks one is literally cut off from the nature of reality, this is incorrect, because we are all embedded participants. There is no place where my identity was created outside of relationship to my parents, my siblings, everyone that I've ever known. This is true for everyone. Like, you can't take away any experience that we've had in our lives and be the same person. So this idea of individuality in any absolute sense is an illusion. And Donald Trump is suffering from this in spades. He has such a psychological boundary, an absolute Saturnian boundary between him and the world, and all the good in the world is on the inside. He's perfect, incapable of doing wrong, in constant denial of anything that is shadowed dimension of his own being. And he's projecting all that onto the outer world. So the outer world is all hostile and negative, and all the good is on the inside. But of course, this isn't the way it actually is. So another really important thing is we moved, describing it just there, is prior to this, it was an I-thou relationship to the universe having intelligence, meaning, purpose, sacred depths. And at the Copernican revolution and the scientific revolution, this gradually gets eclipsed, and it becomes an I-it relationship. We objectify the world, and that's basically our position. It's a material object, and we're in a dominating position, and we have the power and right to exploit it because it was given to us by God or whatever. And you can still hold on to that nonsense. But like, there is real important lessons that we need to take from this and recognize that it's not actually the case. And thankfully, quantum physics is actually helping us do this, because quantum physics describes that participatory embeddedness, not the subject-object division and the objectified world that isn't somehow actually mechanistic. It's relational, and we're part of that relationship. So this is a delusional ideation that we are somehow actually authentically or absolutely separate from nature or the non-human world. It's not the case. And so to kind of sum this up, what's really important about the postmodern period is that we discover Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. So the depths of the human psyche, which they reflect, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, were discovered right as we developed the psychological orientation. So this is the emergence of psychology, because before, like Jung has a great quote, he says, because the stars have fallen from the heavens is why we need a psychology today. That basically the gods and goddesses have become our neuroses, and we have introjected the gods, and they have become our pathologies in many ways, because we don't actually have an authentic connection to them in a transcendent way. And hopefully that may be what's emerging now in a new way, where we have this buffered self, where we have this autonomy, the sense of individuality and agency that is, it's genuine in many ways, but it's not in any absolute sense. And if we're not aligning ourselves with the transits, like when we look at Trump's life and chart, then we end up acting out in an unconscious way the shadow dimensions of them, and often in a maybe in a possessed way, where we're not in control with our conscious agency and will. Yeah, hopefully that makes some level of sense as to where we're at in this moment in time, and hopefully, you know, how we may be on the threshold of a breakthrough of some form where we can recover the meaning and purpose which the planets reflect, that intelligence and relationality and depth, and focus on the human being, that we're meant to be here. We have this actual relationship with the archetypes, and it's up to us to cultivate that relationship. So many people are describing this whole process that we just discussed in our moment right now as a death rebirth moment. And Stanislav Grof is one of the godfathers of the archetypal astrological perspective. And what he recognized in his psychological research is that the human being is born, and in a certain way we complete the birth physically, anatomically, but not psychologically. And in essence, we're carrying a lot of trauma from birth throughout the course of our lives. And we're kind of seeking out experiences often to reconnect with that in some way, to alleviate suffering that is trapped there, and to move into some healing space. And what he recognized was multiple things. Actually, Rick Tarnas actually recognized that there were 4 stages of the birth process that Grof recognized himself through analyzing thousands of people going into deep, profound, non-ordinary states of consciousness experiences. And he saw them over and over again, reliving, reconnecting to moments of the birth trauma and the birth process itself. And he was able to actually identify 4 distinct stages of the birth process. And what Rick recognized, that they actually correspond to the 4 outer planets archetypally. And I'll just give you the two that are important. The two middle matrices, birth divisions or sections of birth, correspond to Saturn and to Pluto, to the two planets that are in the sky right now that are deeply affecting Trump psychology and ours, the collective, and the pandemic and everything. And what they correspond to is the death rebirth process. To Saturn is the contractions, and Pluto is the titanic push to be born. And Pluto corresponds to the death rebirth process itself, to eliminating what's not necessary anymore in order for our fullest potential to be realized. And so what we can recognize here, a couple of things, is that we're all participating in the Saturn-Pluto archetypal dynamics, and that they correspond to particular traumas surrounding birth that we all are still connected to and striving to overcome. And the mantras of "I can't breathe" is a Saturnian contraction of life that's suffocating, that you're preventing when you're being born, you're struggling to breathe. The same thing is happening with the mass extinction and the global climate crisis. It's the Saturnian control over nature and the exploitation of nature that is causing the planet to burn, and for us to also start to describe how we can't breathe, that there's this collective contraction and oppression that's actually coming from our own unfortunate exploitation of the earth, that we need to come into awareness of and get out of the deleterious dynamics that we are creating. Now, who or what is dying? Who or what is being reborn? This is really important because we don't have anywhere to go. We're not going to Mars. That's an illusion. We have to change the nature of our relationship. And this is very possible. All we have to do, in essence, is realize we're an embedded participant, not a separate organism on top of nature in a position to utilize it for our needs, separate from the needs of the earth. We have to realize that we're part of and approach it with that relational dynamic. And I mean, sustainability is the goal. Like, it's the only real goal that humanity has at this point, because it's yet to be accomplished. And if we don't get there, we're not going to make it. Like, we have to find a sustainable relationship to the planet, or else it's over. So I think a big part of what can help us make that transformation is the realization that we're not separate. And the astrological perspective and quantum physics both indicate that we're not separate, and give us a real method, a real capacity, a real opportunity to develop that relationship with our conscious will. Okay, so is it possible that we are moving into a second axial era? If this was the first axial era where religion really came in a profound way cross-culturally, and then the modern scientific era eclipsed it, we separated, we suppressed it, but then we forged autonomy, and then we discovered the three outer planets, and now we're in this position where our hubris and our inflation is destroying the environment to the point where we may not even survive. So are we capable of recognizing the situation and making a transformation? I believe we are, and the astrological perspective seems to indicate a real opportunity and to me, hope, like in the sense that the universe wants us to survive. Like, it would not have set it up to where the astrological perspective exists in order, it doesn't make any sense for there to be intelligence and meaning and purpose that's actually caressing us and inviting us into this relationship if the universe doesn't actually want us to succeed. So, all right, one last thing here. Is this the capacity and opportunity presenting itself also to move into a third order of thinking? I think that may also be what's happening, whereas second order thinking is what emerged at the axial era and the birth of philosophy and the beginning to think about thinking. Well, third order thinking, in my mind, reflects the capacity to engage with the archetypes that are actually informing our thoughts, to move into a new level of awareness surrounding the archetypal energies that are actually moving into why we're thinking. So we're not just thinking about thinking, we're thinking with the energies that are informing our thoughts. And it gives us a new level of agency to move in concert with them rather than being an unconscious puppet of them in the way that Trump is demonstrating for us. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. And I'm sorry if it took us so long to get there, but it's kind of complicated in certain ways. But this is from Rutger Bregman's book. It's called Humankind, A Hopeful History. So a couple of insights that I drew out of Bregman's work is he frames the narrative between Hobbes versus Rousseau type framework, and the idea, in the modern Western civilization, modern West, is Thomas Hobbes, believed that human beings are innately selfish, violent, and greedy, and he described it as a war of all against all. And of course, Rousseau, the Romantic, saw human beings as primarily friendly, compassionate, and generous, with an egalitarian nature aligned with the greater good. Now, he brings some really good examples in the narrative to help us understand, I think, rightly so, how Rousseau is correct and Hobbes is wrong. But one of the real issues that we have is that the modern era was governed by capitalism and the scientific revolution, and it supports more of the Hobbesian view. But we would not have gotten here if we were primarily violent, selfish, and greedy. We wouldn't have made it this far. It's kind of an easy insight in my mind. But anyway, Donald Trump has adopted this in large part because of the sociopathy of his father and the patriarchal impulse there in his early days. And John Lewis is clearly an example of the higher side of our better angels, and oriented towards the beloved community. John Lewis believed that even his oppressors, the slave owners, the white racist, are part of the beloved community. He does not see any separation there, which I also completely agree with. So, yeah, that's a really interesting insight. Now, I think probably the most important insight that I got out of the book was an exploration of the two effects. One called the Pygmalion effect, and one's called the Golem effect. And what I might describe the experiment. So, in 1963, forget his name, did a experiment with his students, and he had two groups of mice, and he told the students that there were a smart group of mice and highly intelligent, and then just like an average group of mice, and he let them hold the mice before they set them into a maze. And what happens is the mice that were supposedly smart win the maze every time. It's like it happens over and over again, and ultimately why they think that is, I mean, of course the mice are not actually more intelligent or less intelligent. It has to do with the way that they're handled. It has to do with the affection that they get. They are made to relax or whatever it is, and they perform better. So the opposite of this is also true, and he gives one example where a foster home director in 1939 in Iowa told half of his foster children that they were going to be great orators, and he told the other half they were going to have speech difficulties, and many of them developed stutters. And that was because they were told that they weren't going to be good speakers. Now, clearly we can see what the issues are here is that if we embrace each other with affection, we are much more likely to perform better and to see ourselves in a better light. And I'm just like applying this to our race relation situation where, we had the Civil War because, we realized that was a grave sin. But instead of turning and embracing African Americans and trying to help them flourish, we segregated them and continuously told them they weren't worthy and built the largest prison system in the world to keep them housed. Now, can you imagine if we had actually turned and embraced African Americans? Can you imagine how much of a flourishing nation we would have, and how less burdened we would be by our tragic past? These are things that we can do, and it has to do with perception and will and the way we look at each other, the way we perceive each other, the way we hold each other, the way we recognize our sameness. We are so much more alike than we are different. Anyone on the planet, you know what a smile looks like. You know when it's genuine. You know what it means. It conveys to you, irrespective of the language that person speaks, how they feel. And we can see it in any culture, any peoples, the way they love their children. Exactly the same. We're not different. We all have a common ancestor, and we also share the same fate collectively. So the sooner we can get over the divisions that we project onto each other, the healthier our collective psyche will be. And just to throw it on top, like the astrological perspective doesn't discriminate in any way. Like, there aren't better charts for white people or black people. It's like, or male and female or anything. It's simply a democratized capacity for any person to engage in that relationship. Now, we're going to do this really briefly before we go into the very current things that are happening right now. Now, this is the Uranus-Pluto cycle. If we look at the Uranus-Pluto alignments, this is taken directly from Cosmos and Psyche, the evidence in Cosmos and Psyche. So the Uranus-Pluto opposition from 1787 to 1798 was the French Revolution, like this decade, the French Revolutionary decade. And this was also the real origins of the beginning of the anti-slavery movement, the founding of the Society for the Abolition of Slave Trade, Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce, 1787, Free African Society of Philadelphia, the Society of Friends of Blacks in France, Autobiography of Freed Slave Olawando Ekwano, say that correctly, Abandonment of the Slave Trade in Denmark, 1792, First Successful Revolution, Slave Revolution in Haiti, and France freed all slaves in 1794. The Uranus-Pluto conjunction, 1844 through 56, is just prior to the Civil War. Frederick Douglass, Autobiography, 1845. The publication of the North Star, 1847. The Underground Railroad, with Harriet Tubman. Sojourner Truth's Autobiography in 1850. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852. John Brown's Militant Anti-Slavery Campaign. Founding of the Free Soil Party. Founding of the Republican Party. Henry David Thoreau on the duty of civil disobedience. All these things, helped to bring about the Civil War. Now, the next opposition, 1896 to 1907, W. E. Du Bois, first organized black protest, founded the Niagara Movement, Publication for the Souls of Black Folks. Booker T. Washington, calls for the education of black people. First Pan-African Conference, London, 1900. Founding of the Congo Reform Association, 1904. Founding of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, 1904. National American Women's Suffrage Association, 1905. Gandhi begins his nonviolent resistance in 1906. All of these things were leading to civil rights movement. So in the 30s, there was a square, 1928 through 37. And fascinatingly, jazz is probably one of the most important phenomena phenomenons that helped speed up integration, because you have a transcendent principle, music, that is able to unite what is otherwise seen as disparate or divisionary, divisive. And this is a harbinger for the future, I believe. So 1960 to 72, the civil rights decade, where Martin Luther King, the Nonviolent Civil Rights Movement, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, Black Power Movement, John Lewis, Bayard Rustin's Freedom Riders, James Baldwin, Stokely Carmichael, Angela Davis, Eldridge Cleaver, Nelson Mandela. And our current decade, Uranus was square to Pluto from 2007 up to this year. And it corresponded to the election of the first black president, the Black Lives Matter movement, the police shooting of the unarmed black men culminated in the murder of George Floyd, igniting global protests. This is, what led up to the global protests. The Occupy Wall Street movement, Arab Springs, and this was also the rise of China. You see the rise of fascism in the 30s as well. So now we look at the Saturn-Pluto alignments that led right up to our current moment as well. So this is just after the Civil War, Saturn-Pluto opposition, and the founding of the Ku Klux Klan and the Knights of White Camellia. The next conjunction, 1882 to 84, was the first Immigration Act against Chinese people. And the next conjunction was World War I, 1913 to 1916. This is also the reestablishment of the Ku Klux Klan after the release of Birth of a Nation. Woodrow Wilson also segregated the federal government, World War I. It's interesting, the retraction of the British Empire after this, which I think we can see again now with the retraction of the United States at this Saturn-Pluto moment, possibly becoming not the sole superpower anymore. But this is the Great Depression, Saturn opposite Pluto in a T-square with Uranus. In the 1939 to 41, Saturn square Pluto was World War II and the Holocaust and Japanese internment camps here. Again, psychological splitting and othering. And 1946 to 48, conjunction, Saturn-Pluto conjunction, establishment of the Iron Curtain, beginning of the Cold War, the Arab-Israeli War, Israel-Palestine partition, India-Pakistan partition, apartheid in South Africa. So 1980 to 84, Saturn-Pluto conjunction. It's the outbreak of AIDS. It's the peak of the Cold War and another recession. 1992 to 94, a square, the Rodney King verdict and preceding riots. 1994, the crime bill, which led to excessive imprisonment of African Americans, again, splitting, oppression, subjugation, and the Rwandan genocide took place here. This is where, all of a sudden interwed people started to other each other, and mass genocide took place. So 2000 to 2004, this is the 9/11 period where SARS outbreak came, and this is when AIDS had reached pandemic proportions in Africa. So it's interesting, you see the same correspondence, right? Because the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, AIDS comes out, and then the opposition, it reaches pandemic. So same thing we can see with the initial outbreak of the Black Plague, as well as we can see with SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2. Same alignments, 20 years apart, basically. And like I said, 9/11, Putin assumes power in Russia. And our last financial crisis, which was a subprime mortgage crisis, which, again, targeting low-income, often African-American people who suffered the most from it, of course, like poor people, and the Syrian civil war. So, and the MERS, I didn't mention MERS outbreak in 2012. It was kind of in the middle between the opposition and our current conjunction. So this is the current conjunction, Saturn-Pluto conjunction. It was square to Uranus at the very earliest, at the beginning of the pandemic, actually, and corresponds clearly to giant recession, largest quarantine in history, the Black Lives Matter revolution. So it's both a Uranus-Pluto energy and a Saturn-Pluto energy, because it's a moral accounting. We're facing the shadow of the depths of who we are, of white people, of what we have done to African Americans, of what we've done to the earth. This is our task. This is our great work. This is what we have to do right now. in order to become agents of healing in society. So the word disaster is derived from the mid-16th century Italian disastro, which means ill-starred event, or dis meaning negation, o star. So interesting. Catastrophe derives from the Greek kata, which means down, and strophin, which means turning. So a downturning is catastrophe. And for the ancient Greek mind, the celestial heavens represented eternal perfection. And catastrophe, or downturning, describes events which turned against the orderly perfection of the heavens. And it seems as though that's, again, what we're doing. We're out of alignment with the larger whole, and we're experiencing a downturning. Apocalypse, interestingly, actually means to uncover, to reveal. And this is clearly revealed the systemic racism, the systemic oppression, the inequalities that we have created. I mean, there's so much that's being revealed right now, shadow dimensions of our society, of ourselves, that we can move into a new relationship with and heal. The word crisis means, interesting, a power of distinguishing decision, choice, or judgment, specifically corresponding to the turning point of a disease when an important decision is made leading either to recovery or death. I think this is where we're at. This is a crisis, and the pandemic is actually a climate change event. It has to do specifically with human encroachment or exploitation of the non-human world, and the consequences of that exploitation is a virus jumping from another species into ours. Yes, so we are in a crisis, and how we respond, the decisions that we make, will largely shape the future that we grow into. Now, the first 2 hours of this presentation was recorded on October 20th. It is now October 21st, and I'd like to just correct a couple of things that I recognized in the video from last night, which is when we are looking at these patterns, these are called diachronic and synchronic alignments, meaning we see them over time. Dia means across, and chronic, time. So, and synchronic meaning at the same time. This is the way Rick describes it in Cosmos and Psyche. I just wasn't in touch with the language yesterday. And so, like what we can see, for example, with the, say, Uranus-Pluto alignment of the 1960s and the civil rights movement that crystallized so powerfully at that time, which led to the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act, that the next alignment, when Barack Obama becomes the first black president, that's a diachronic patterning of archetypal symbolism of the Uranus-Pluto archetypal energies manifesting, and the synchronic would be everything that happens within the same alignment. So, and then one other thing is, I forgot to mention that the Mars-Neptune alignment in Fred Trump Jr.'s chart, you often see with Mars-Neptune, or not going to say often, but yes, I mean, it happens frequently that people experience struggles with addictions, because Neptune is the imagination and our stream of consciousness, but it's also the escape valve. Like Neptune corresponds to everything that transcends the physical world. Saturn, the physical world, the responsibilities of daily life, that type of thing. And in his chart, natal chart, Saturn opposite the Sun corresponds to that challenging relationship with his father, and the reality of that kind of constantly oppressing one. And it just logically kind of makes sense that his quest, his Mars quest, was in a Neptunian pursuit of wanting to escape, in a sense, to transcend the really challenging, difficult relationship he had with his father. So yeah, it's a really interesting and very, I think, strong correlation, and it's very helpful in understanding the larger dynamics. And just a couple of corrections on the evolution of consciousness mandala. I stated that Rick would never refer to the mandala as the psychological individuation of humanity, and I think it's more technically accurate to say that he hasn't referred to it in that way, to my knowledge. And I believe he recognizes this process more along the lines of the Graphian perinatal matrices and more of a birth process itself, and kind of recognizing the Copernican revolution as like a crowning moment of the birth moment itself. And this would be the full development into an individuated state. So, and I guess maybe also I failed to mention the Gebser and Piaget connections, because that is the edge of my knowledge. I've just broached their work. I'm not as familiar with it, and I didn't feel like I could speak authoritatively on it in any way, really. And I'm really interested in any insights that you may have, that people who have studied Gebser and Piaget's work, and to see if there are overlaps between Gebser's structures and Piaget's different stages of development that correspond to these different stages of the worldviews that in our evolution. So I want to close out the presentation here with a quick review of Trump's natal chart and transits for the election and the transition, and maybe a year or so out, and also look at the collective transits for the next year or two, and to help us understand maybe what we can expect relative to the pandemic crisis that we're all working through. So again, this is Donald Trump's natal chart on the inside. This is the transits for the election on the outside. And what I would like to point out that I didn't bring in before, which is the nodes. These are the nodes, the nodal axes, and they represent where the eclipses take place. And so he's born with the sun conjunct the nodes, and because he's born during a lunar eclipse. And what that represents is the north node has to do with karma, and the south node with dharma, like your past, what you're bringing into this life. And, or I'm sorry, the reverse. The karma from the past, the south node, and the dharma is your future. And what's interesting is it's an 18-year cycle, goes around, or it goes around the zodiac every 18 years, and it happens to be returning to that position for Donald Trump at this point in his life, after however many 18-year cycles it's been. And this, again, kind of just re-emphasizes the karmic challenge and impotency that is of this moment for him. And clearly I described, the actual shadow effects, or working with the eclipse energy itself, in the previous portion of the presentation. But this is just an added layer of potency that we can ascribe or recognize that's taking place at this moment. Now, one thing I didn't bring in before is this is the planet Eris, or planetoid dwarf planet, that was discovered in 2005, which is responsible for Pluto's demotion. Now, we know in the astrological perspective, Pluto has not lost any of its potency. It is an extremely potent archetype, and that's to our advantage in many ways, because it's very clear in its manifestations. So, and it hasn't lost any of its potency since the discovery of Eris. But Eris is the archetypal description of the goddess, is the goddess of strife and chaos. Now, in his chart, Trump's chart, natal chart, at 6 Aries, Eris at 6 Aries, is in a square to Mercury and opposite Neptune, the part of him that is the pathological liar, that is constantly distorting the facts. And he's a chaos agent, and he is a conspiracy theorist, and he has brought chaos and discord into the discourse of American politics and society in general. It's a very kind of reflective archetypal energy for his actual manifestation of his thought process and communication processes. What's another further interesting combination here, it seems, is that Chiron is transiting Eris at this moment, square to natal Mercury, and potentially, like I've been emphasizing the entire time, that this is a learning moment, that we're learning. He's teaching us a tremendous amount about the shadow dimensions and possession states of archetypal complexes. And yeah, so a healing function is also taking place, I believe, if we grok the situation correctly and integrate it and move forward. Now, what I think we can move, if we, like I mentioned, the eclipse will be highly revealing of more depth of his shadow possession, I'm guessing. And yesterday, I understand he walked out of a interview with Leslie Stahl of 60 Minutes, and clearly frustrated with the questioning because his answers cannot address them in a way that would be satisfactorily healing for himself and for us. It's clear. He's so far gone in his own delusions that when he's actually faced with authentic questions about the real nature of reality, he can't handle it because he's out there in a delusion denying the facts that we are in the midst of a very deadly pandemic that is about to get a lot worse, and he's still saying it's about to end. Just straight fucking delusion and denial, I'm sorry. But that's what's going on. And I think what we can, unfortunately, what's going to happen after he's removed from office is Neptune at 18 Pisces is going to continue to square his sun for the next several years. It gets exact for the first time in May of 2021, and this won't end for many years. I mean, Jupiter will come in and magnify it here in the 2022 period, and who knows? I'm not going to do any predictions, but I guess I will say that it's likely that he will become less and less connected to reality as we perceive it. He will become more and more detached and more escaping into his own fantasy world, into his own delusions. Just my guess. But now I want to look at the outer planet alignments for the next couple of years. So the Saturn-Pluto, Jupiter-Saturn-Pluto triple conjunction is what corresponds to the downturning, the pandemic, the facing of shadow, moral evolution that's taking place. And what's also, when the pandemic first started, it was right when Uranus really began to square Saturn. I'm sorry, when Saturn began to square Uranus. And when we move out of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction over this next year, Saturn will continue to move into the square with Uranus. So Saturn will move into the square with Uranus over the course of the spring really tightly, and it will continue through 2023, off and on, moving back and forth through retrograde periods. So this is the square alignment here, and you can see it. I'm moving in months, so every click is a month, and we see how that alignment lasts for a good 2 years. Let's see, I think it comes back one more time. Yep. And it's really tight there again. And let's see if it does it again. Not quite. So it ends roughly in January of 2023. So basically, Uranus is opening, progress, moving forward, and Saturn is often closing down or restricting or conservative. So I think it makes sense that we're likely to see, openings and shutdowns, and like back and forth, largely because the virus is so widespread that it's not going to go away anytime soon because there's so much of it in our nation. And the vaccines, if let's say they're 50 or 60 or 70% effective and only half the people take them, then it's still, you only have like 30 or 40% immunity, and it doesn't, herd immunity it will not happen. It's a coronavirus. It's like the common cold in the way that it transmits, and most likely the way that our immune system fights it off, because people are recognizing that people are only holding immunities for about 6 months. I mean, I don't know how widespread and how, if that'll be a constant thing for everyone, but that's happening for some people, which means that your immunity after you've gotten the virus and overcome it only lasts for about 6 months. So you're going to have to take the vaccine 6 months later, and even like how long the vaccine lasts, you may end up having to take the vaccine every 6 months or a year or something in order to actually be protected. And even at that level, you may not be protected because it's only 50 or 70% effective. So we may be wearing masks for 3 or 4 years. We may be opening and shutting down the economy back and forth depending on the spread of the virus for 3 or 4 years. So I'm just throwing it out there that it seems like this kind of open close it would fit the archetypal dynamics over the next several years. So I think that was really what I wanted to say, and basically take care of each other. We're all in this together. Um, there really are no Republicans or Democrats or white people or black people. We're all human beings. There's much less different about us than there is alike. And all of these weird projections and ideations that we have and fears about others are our own fears that we need to come to terms with, facing our own shadow, integrating it, and becoming less divisive, more loving, more open, more healing towards ourselves and each other and the earth. Yeah, we can do this. There's a lot of opportunity and hope in my mind that we can make drastic, transformative changes about how we see ourselves and how we see our relationship to each other and to the earth. It's just perspective, and it's changed a lot in the past. And the disenchanted, nihilistic, othering, mechanistic approach to reality is only about 400 years old or less, really. And it's temporary. It's the first time in history that we have run this experiment that we don't believe in a transcendent reality that is informing our experience. And you can see what happens when you throw off the moral restraint. You get a lot of corruption and people believing they can do what they want without being held to account because they don't believe that there is a higher authority that holds us to account. And it seems as though that is not actually the case. The astrological perspective indicates strongly that there is a higher authority, and we can actually develop an authentic communication and relationship with that authority. So lots of hope in my mind. I know there's a very difficult road ahead, and the primary two things I would say, I guess, to close it out is sustainability in our relationship to the planet, and facing the shadow, particularly of white European descendants, and how we have psychologically split, denied, and othered everyone that we did not see as like, and the horrific consequences that are very present in our society because of it. So, yeah, lots of love, everyone. Take care of each other. Don't take up arms against one another. It's karmically debilitating, and yeah, take care of everyone. Much love. Be well, and we'll talk again soon.